Hello, everybody. My name is Caroline Bichetto, and I am the Community Agriculture Engagement Coordinator at King Conservation District. And I want to welcome you to our presentation of Benefits and Beauty of Landscaping with Native Plants. And actually, in past years, we've held this event in a brewery or a cafe. And while I really wish I could see all of your faces in person, we're really happy that we can still connect tonight in a safe way. And we can actually reach so many more of you this year because we're on Zoom. So I think that that's pretty awesome. So I hope you all can grab a blanket and a warm drink and that you're ready to enjoy this presentation. So first off, I'd like to introduce King Conservation District and tell you a bit about what we do. So KCD is a non-regulatory natural resource assistance agency authorized by Washington State. And our mission is to promote the sustainable use of natural resources through responsible stewardship. We have a three-prong model for delivering services through education, technical assistance, and implementation. And we strive to help you achieve your goals in terms of managing your land and resources, as well as our collective goal of improving the health of our lands and waters. So native planting can help achieve both of those goals, which leads me to our presentation this evening. We have the privilege of hosting Senior Riparian Resource Specialist, Jacobus Saperstein today, and he is going to teach you the basics of selecting native plant species and integrating them into your backyard. Jacobus brings with him years of experience in planning and implementing restoration projects, so I'm grateful that he's offering his time and expertise to us tonight.
I'm a senior resource specialist on the riparian team at the King Conservation District. I've been working there for 12 years. Being on the riparian team means I get to work with a lot of landowners that live along water bodies. So streams, lakes, rivers, shorelines of any sort here in King County, and help to educate and inspire and motivate them to restore some of these habitats, oftentimes taking degraded ecosystems, these shoreline habitats riddled with invasive species, and transitioning it to a more fully functioning, native, thriving riparian community of native plants. So my contact information will be provided at the end if you happen to be a landowner that lives along an aquatic area that is interested in learning more and potentially implementing such a project. We have some grant funding to help landowners along shorelines. Water quality is a big concern in King County. Salmon issues are huge, and you'll learn a little bit about that through this presentation, but hopefully the goal of this presentation is largely to inspire all landowners to learn a little bit about how to be a plant detective of your own conditions on your site and ultimately pick the right plant for the right place, and get inspired to start moving down your own pathway and journey to incorporating more native plants on your parcel of this earth. You know, the agenda for my talk, we'll get into first kind of just some basic ground rules, if you will, about native plants, some terminology. So we're kind of all in the same place. We'll talk a little bit about stock types, so different forms that you can purchase plants, and some of the pros and cons of the different types of plant material you can try to source. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to investigate your own yard for soil and water and light conditions, and why that's important, and how to do your own little site assessment. And then ultimately leading to you doing your best job of trying to pick the right plant for the right place to get good survivorship. And then we'll also have a heavy dose of slides for the second half of the show, if you will, on my favorite native plants that are pretty easy to work with. So focusing on trees and shrubs and a little bit of ground covers, and what ones that you can have pretty good success with that aren't super picky or finicky, as long as you kind of meet the the basic requirements of a wet site or a dry site. I break it down into kind of different categories of conditions that these plants like. So yeah, well, let's get started. So, why do we use native plants? As you may already know, if you're already here and you live in the Northwest, water quality is a huge issue for our salmon, and there's nothing better than native plants along the streams and banks of our aquatic areas. Salmon and a whole host of organisms that that the salmon depend on and the water quality depends on, really needs cold, clear water. So having native plants, even fairly narrow buffer strips of native plants along water bodies in King County, or excuse me, in the Pacific Northwest in general, is really hugely important for the water quality. The shade that the trees and the shrubs provide keep the water cool in the summer. The insects that fall and the detritus that falls into the river from our native plants is really great for the whole riparian ecosystem. But if you don't live along the water, there's a whole host of other wildlife benefits out there. And one of the first things that a lot of my landowners that I work with always remark on is just as they start transitioning their yards and their landscapes to more natives, is just the increased diversity of birds coming through their landscapes. That's a real easy one, a win-win, pretty quickly to see on your property. Our native plants and native birds have co-evolved through millennia to recognize them as a food source and provide food throughout a whole wide range of seasons. So, but then also a lot of people, get into it because they're just beautiful plants too. And so the last slide on the right is a little bit of a funny photo if you're looking at it, but I like it in there. It's we do a trying to highlight kind of that you can make it look pretty even in a very small environment. Every year we've done a display garden at the Northwest Flower and Garden Show, and that's our display garden from last year. Unfortunately, we're not doing it again this year because of COVID, but next year when this is all behind us, I encourage you guys to go to the Northwest Flower and Garden Show. It's usually in February, Seattle Convention Center, and come check out our booth and look at the native plants and feel and touch and smell them up close and get inspired there. But I also want to say that, I do this line of work as a restoration practitioner or a restoration ecologist. So that's really my training and my background, is using plants to kind of move the dial for ecosystem benefits and health. But there's a lot of crossover with just making it really pretty and landscaping with these natives. But that's not really my forte and focus. However, personally, I do own a home, and I just moved to a new home, and I wanted to throw this little slide in because over the last couple of weeks, my COVID project has been ripping out grass on the side yard of my house and incorporating natives. You can still see I've got some plants to work on planting there. A couple in the pots waiting for me for this weekend. But yeah, you can transition, low level ecosystems like a grass lawn and transition it into a really beautiful native plant garden if you put a little bit of sweat equity into it. But back to some of the basics of native plants. So we're using that term native plants, but that's a big, broad term. So where are we talking? It's all a matter of scale. So for this, every plant is native to Earth. right? But really for the focus of this, we're talking native plants to the Puget Sound lowlands. Plants that are going to do well for probably the majority of you on this call living in the lowlands of Puget Sound. As you know, the plants that I'm recommending will work well in these areas, but not maybe so well if you live in really high elevations, or say you're on the east side of the state, very different climate conditions. So that's really where this talk is focused on. Also, I'll be on a lot of my slides focusing on not only common names, but throwing out scientific names. So these are the Latin names that is much more uniform across like nurseries. If you go to buy plants, the more you can do some research to find out the correct scientific name, the more assurance you're going to be that you're actually getting the true native species that you're looking for. Because the common names can sometimes be misleading. For instance, if you want a huckleberry, well, there's a lot of kinds of huckleberries. If you go to a nursery, you know, we have several huckleberries that are native here in the lowlands of Puget Sound. On the image on the right, it's the red huckleberry, Vaccinium parviflorum. But, you know, native to the eastern side of the state, there's high bush huckleberry and more. So they're both Vacciniums, but with different species names. So usually what you need to know is the genus, which is, here I have a little pointer, the first word here, which is capitalized, and then lowercase, the last word is the species name. So genus and species will usually get you to the right level if you're talking at a nursery, in addition to the common name helping, but not always being perfect. Okay. And of course, when we're talking about native plants, the opposite of that is non-native plants, right? So here, there are, in talking about non-native plants, there's another level that is a concern, more of a concern, are the non-natives that are invasive plants. So not all non-native plants, in fact, the vast majority of non-native plants are not invasive at all, and they can coexist in your yard and not be a problem, if you will. But there are subsets of non-native plants that have a certain competitive advantage in our environment and are causing troublesome ecological damage and harm. So this talk is not focused around invasive species management, excuse me. But I do want to highlight a little bit, because I want to highlight a few of the bad bullies, because I do recognize that a lot of people come here and come to native plants out of the fact that they might have non-native plants that are invasive and an issue in their yard that they're trying to move the dial away from. So anyway, for instance, you know, just some of these photos you're probably familiar with is blackberry, Himalayan blackberry, butterfly bush down here, which is actually still sold in a lot of our nurseries because it does have beautiful qualities to it, and butterflies are attracted to it. Cherry laurel is a variety of laurel sold in nurseries still, unfortunately, because they are evergreen and provide nice hedges that people plant on their borders of their property. Ivy, you know, we probably all know about English ivy and its detrimental effects of, you know, creating a monoculture on the ground. But then also, one thing I want to point out is how it goes up trees and causes lots of damage going up trees. And I bring this up because one of the things I want you to think about is that if you're trying to change and move the dial on your property and you might like that ivy, think about you might dislike or like some qualities of it. Like the ivy, you might like that it provides evergreen ground cover. that is pretty impenetrable by weeds. So if you like that form and that function of that non-native invasive, try to replicate that form or function that it's providing in a native plant. So here on the right, we have a native kind of alternative to English ivy of Salal, Gualtheria shalom. Now, Salal will get taller than ivy, so that is something that you might want to weigh and balance if it is a true one-to-one kind of alternative for you. But the gist is trying to get think about what that invasive plant might have provided for you. Here's some other photos of the Salal, and try to match that in a native, if that's the way you want to go. For instance, here on the left, maybe you have a trellis of climbing clematis, which is another, well, there's many varieties of clematis. There's some that are non-native and quite invasive and get loose into parks and climb up trees and smother trees just like ivy does here on the right. But if you're looking for that climbing vine type thing, we have a couple of those as native plants too. Not very common and a little bit hard to find. Oh, sorry, that's the ivy going to berry. When it goes vertical on trees or climbing on walls, it'll produce its berries. So one thing I like to try to encourage homeowners, if you're not going to get ivy off all the ground, at least get it off the trees by cutting it and kind of waist high down and pulling it down to the ground so that all the other vines will die up above and it won't be producing berries if it stays on the ground. Sorry, this is a native climbing vine of the orange honeysuckle. And I think really beautiful and also much more beneficial to wildlife. The hummingbirds love this. I mean, with the trumpet flowers, it's just made for the hummingbirds. So a little bit of a hard one to find at nurseries, but it's out there if you hunt. And there's another species too of it, the hairy honeysuckle, Lonicera hispidula, and you can look for that one too. So that's my little bit about invasive species and trying to transition away from non-native invasives. But there's another agency out there called the King County Noxious Weeds. They are really a great resource for people. They have a website on King County's website with a whole bunch of fact sheets on best management practices for how to remove blackberry, ivy, and all sorts of non-native invasive weeds, and a whole categorization on class A, B, C, for noxious weeds. They're the noxious weed specialists. When I say noxious weeds, I mean non-native invasive species. Sorry. So moving on from that and looking forward to, implementing native plants on your property, one of the things I want to educate people on is 3 main different types of plant material out there and some of the pros and cons. So here on the left is a picture of bare root plants. That's where there's literally bare roots and the tree or shrub above. There's no soil contained, like in the picture to the right, in a pot. So potted material or containered plant material can come in a variety of different sizes. Often people buy a little, 4 inches to 1 gallon pots, 2 gallon pots, literally all the way up to ball and burlap type stock, really big. And then to the left is, to the right is our attempted image of a live steak. So we'll talk a little bit about live steaks and their pros and cons. So potted material, like I said, this is soil with little plants in there. This is actually our nursery growing plants for our restoration projects. They were probably bare root plants just starting in pots. And these are great. You know, they're the most readily available for you to work with. You can find them at your local garden center. This is the kind of material you find. It's the most flexible to work with in the sense that you can buy it, leave it in your yard for several weeks to several months, decide to plant it later. They tend to have very high success rate when you plant them. But the main negative of potted material is going to be that they're the most expensive type of plant material. You know, retail nurseries are going to be selling, you know, one pot of a 1 gallon. It might be $10, $15, depending on the species and where you're getting it from. So that's really the only main negative of potted material, is that it tends to be the most expensive. Less common to get your hands on, but much less expensive. Live stakes. So another thing that people don't often actually know about is that there's some species, especially these species that like to live along aquatic areas, like willow, red osier dogwood, cottonwood, black twinberry. That's just listing kind of the main species that will actually work well to plant as live stakes. So that's a picture of a little willow stake. Usually we buy them or harvest them ourselves, and usually cut them down to about 3 feet. And this is literally just a side arm of the whole fake background, you can't see my arm. A side arm branch of a mature willow that we take cuttings off of, usually in the fall when they've lost their leaves. And then you can use that live stake now to jam into moist soils along the riverbank or wetland pond or wherever you might want, as long as the conditions are moist and right for that species. You can bury it about halfway down, and it's going to start a whole new plant from that live stake. So most people probably won't have access to buying things in live stakes. Like, you don't find that at a retail nursery, but you might have an existing willow on your property already, or one of these other species that I'm listing there on the left. And you can selectively thin them out and reuse that plant material for free. There are more species that this can work, but I list these 4, and really these top 3 work a lot better than twinberry, and willow is the restoration superstar that it really live staking works really, really well with. So and then bare root material and plugs, I'll talk a little bit about. On this here with the pointer on the left side, that's a picture of a young bare root Douglas fir. And so these are plants that have been harvested in fields in the winter time when they're fully dormant, usually around now through for the next couple of months. They lift them out of these nurseries that are growing tens of thousands of them, and they put them in freezers or coolers just before freezing temperature, like 34 degrees. And then they can ship them out to restoration projects, reforestry projects. And the problem for you guys is that they're not readily available for you. However, that's the beauty of conservation districts. Most conservation districts, or maybe I'll say many conservation districts in our state, offer a once-a-year bare root plant sale. And we do too, and you'll learn a little bit more of it here coming up. But once a year, you can get your hands on bare root material. And for instance, we're selling about 70 different species. And this is an example of about a 12-inch start, which is about the smallest that we tend to source. Bare root material can be anywhere from really like 3 6 inches tall. but all the way up to 3 feet tall. We try to source the bigger end of things because we know people are going to put them straight into restoration projects or planting projects and want bigger material. So most of our plants are typically bigger, meaning 12 to 18 inches, kind of more like 18 inches, depending on the species. The big benefit of bare root material is that they're cheap. So, you know, you get them in bundles of 10 through us, anywhere from like $1, $1.60, $1.70 a plant, depending on the species. So you can really stretch your project dollars out a lot with going with bare root material. But there's a few things that I want to highlight for taking care of bare root materials, because one of the negatives is that they can be a lot more susceptible to mortality. If you can imagine, they don't have that moist soil around their roots once you buy them, or as soon as they're lifted out of the ground. So, you know, being kept in a cooler for a while is helpful. Shipped in moist bags is helpful. But by the time you get them, they've already gone through some stress. So what we like to recommend if you're using bare root material, as soon as you get them, rehydrate that plant in a bucket of water for a couple of hours, probably not more than a day, and then heal them into a hole in your yard in a nice shady, damp area. Meaning dig one big hole, put all the roots of all the plants that you bought into that hole, cover it, backfill it with the soil. Don't bury it, you know, the top part of the plant, just bury the roots so that they're tucked in. Maybe you want to water that hole in real nice to get it nice and moist. And as long as they're in a shady, cool spot of your yard, they can often last there with very little stress for several weeks. It's better to plant them, you know, as soon as possible. And some species more so than others. And I like to say, as a rule of thumb, if it's leafing out and budding out already, start planting those species first. Some species like to bud out earlier than others, like Indian plum. Or if they're an evergreen, plant them earlier too. So like a conifer plant like this, Douglas fir, try to get those in the ground sooner than later, especially broadleaf evergreens. So that's something like a tall Oregon grape or low Oregon grape. We'll show you some photos of that later, I think. Anyway, plugs are a little, that's what's the photo here on the right. Those are very little starts where they're actually grown in a little cylinder of soil. So they're not truly bare roots, but they should be treated kind of similarly as a bare root. And you can soak them and then heal them in. Okay. And I think soon we're going to have a break for questions. Oh, but here's a slide on just our bare root plant sale. We are taking orders now. There'll be a little link to it later with the website. The pickup. So the key is order early because we run out of stuff. We're already selling out of stuff. And come pick it up at the Tukwila Community Center on March 6th. There's only like one day to pick it up. And then here's a couple customers just to give you an idea, an example of, you know, what these plants look like. You might have ordered 50 plants and think, oh my God, do I need to bring a truck? No, all 50 plants will be in a bag, something that looks something like this, with moist soil wrapped around the roots. They're just enough to last a day or so before you can get them home and soak them and heal them in. So that's a little bit about our bare root sale. Here's another picture of kind of a little bit bigger, more like an 18-inch grand fir, most likely. Okay, moving along. The last thing that I want to say with these 3 different types of plants and some of the pros and cons, this is the typical planting window that I like to inform people about. Is we like to plant here in the Northwest when it's going to be the least stressful for our plants, and they're going to have the most success getting their roots established in nice moist soils without needing to water them a ton. So that lends itself to the wet season. So really, October through April is the best time to plant. If you have your choice, probably the fall, like right now, is ideal. Plants are fully shut down and dormant. And so roughing their roots up and planting them in the ground is going to be, they're going to tolerate that really well. And then they're going to actually, in our mild temperatures out here, do quite a bit of root growth all winter long and getting ready to make those soil root connections so that when they bud out and leaf out, they've got the best chance to soak up moisture and make it through that first summer. And it's that first summer drought stress that tends to be the hardest, heaviest mortality year of all. So anyway, potted material, because you can get it early, any time of the year, you can buy them even in the middle of the summer, but I don't recommend planting in the middle of the summer. And you can plant all the way through that full winter. Stakes, I like to say, try not to plant stakes past end of February, because now you're planting a plant that has no roots. So if you plant that willow in April, it's going to bud out in April, May at least, and it's not going to have the roots grown out of that stake to really soak up and support the leaf bud out. So you might see it leaf out, but then die a month later because it's not able to stay hydrated enough. So, and then bare roots, bare roots can't be planted this full planting season because they're not even available from nursery suppliers. So like I said, they need to be kind of really fully shut down. December is when they really start lifting them out of the ground and processing them at the bare root facilities, and then starting to ship them to places like conservation districts and forestry projects in around late December, early January. But it's often a rolling process of some species first. And so that's why we usually have a sweet spot of early March, when we know that we can get all the species out of the ground and to you guys. Okay, 5 minutes of questions. Caroline, do you want to look at the chat box and see if where we're at right now, people have questions?
Yeah. So we have had some awesome questions rolling in the chat. Actually, we've gotten a couple of questions about removing grass or suppressing grass when trying to transition your yard into more of a native habitat. So Florence asked if can you plant, or can a native plant that's up to 15 inches high grow over and suppress grass, or do you need to dig up the grass first before planting?
Better if you can dig it up, and that's what I did in my small little side yard, because had the time and effort to where we actually and there's various tools. We did half of it about with just shoveling it out, and then the other half we rented, just like they make manual sod removers, which is just kind of like a push tool that like slices a blade underneath the grass at a set depth of several inches. And then you can roll up that lawn. And we actually had our neighbor that needed some lawn, and we just gave it to our neighbor. So, and then, or you can get mechanical ones that are power operated if you really have to do a lot of sod removal. But a 15-inch small bare root plant is not going to shade out your grass, especially in that first year, second year, or third year. It's going to take 5+ years before those native plants grow up, provide enough dense shade to then ultimately they will heavily outcompete the grass. You might still have gaps in little grass here and there, but your big challenge is going to be that grass sucks up a lot of moisture in the summer. Any little rains that they get, grass can be a real contributor to plant stress and mortality. So if you're not addressing the grass in some way around your newly establishing native plants, you're doing a real disservice to your project. So think about ways of incorporating mulch rings around your native plants that you planted in that grass, scalping the grass away like a good 2-foot ring circular around the plant, and then putting the mulch down is even better. Cardboard or heavy layers of newspaper and then mulch on top of that can really help create a good safe haven ring around the plant to get as much moisture as it can in those first establishing years.
Awesome, thanks, Jacobus. We have another question about grass, but yeah, so Brian is asking if there are any native grass substitutes that you recommend for folks who kind of miss having a lawn or having a place to sit.
Sure, yeah, there are. There didn't used to be really until, I don't know, I started seeing 5 years ago, these kind of lawn alternatives that they're not going to be as durable as a true lawn turf grass in terms of playing sports on it and running around on it. But there are these, and there are now even some native kind of lawn alternative seed mixes, or mostly native. And maybe you can look it up and put it in the chat box, a plug to, I think it's called Northwest Meadowscapes, is a for-profit place that sells fabulous native seeds. If you're interested in all sorts of native pollinator seed mixes, for one, but they also make like I think they call it like a mostly native lawn alternative. So very low growing kind of prairie grass and forbs, kind of and flowering plants that you might be able to, walk sporadically in, sit in, but again, it's not going to hold up like a true turf would. But yeah. So yeah, Northwest Meadowscapes, or I think is their name.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacobus. Yeah, I just sent the link to that website in the chat.
Great.
Do you think we have time for another question, or should we save it for the next question round?
Let's keep going. I'm maybe a little bit behind, actually. Sorry, folks. But we have another questions break in the middle and then at the very end too. So I'll leave time for that. So I know everyone really likes to get to the pretty plant pics and plant photos, but we'll get a little bit of info here on right plant, right place. So soil, water, and light, right? Those are all three main things to consider. And what I'm just trying to do is have you think about making a little restoration site map on your yard, or maybe you can keep it all in your head or draw it out, sketch it out, sometimes helps, but where you're pairing and looking at your yard to see where are the dry areas, where are the wet areas, and then where are the areas that get the most sun through the arc of the day, thinking of that, and where you get the most shade, and putting those two factors together can really help steer the right plant to the right place. And a couple of things about that also is soil. So to know like how well does your soil actually hold moisture and keep it available to your native plants throughout that summer especially. And one of the things that I like to highlight that really drives your soils in your yard is the fact that we're dealing with a legacy of the last ice age here, 10,000 plus years ago. The Cordilleran ice sheet sat a mile thick over this whole Puget Sound, stretching down to about Olympia. So 5,000, think of that, 5,000 feet of ice compacting soils. And believe it or not, those compacted soil layers are often fairly shallow in our soil profile. And that compaction layer is really an impervious layer to not allow water to move through very readily, very fast. So if you're in flat areas, that actually can lead to a lot of ponding. But if you're, because the water is not percolating through. But on top of that compaction layer is what's called glacial till, which is actually very droughty soils. It's very unconsolidated fines that are real porous and rocky stuff. So if you have these soils where you go out and dig and you find a lot of like golf balls and baseball sized rocks intermixed with kind of sandy-ish soils, you are probably sitting on some of this glacial till. And it's pretty much throughout most of the hills of King County and the lower Puget Sound. So if you think about, if you live in the higher hills, you're probably on this glacial till type soil that will lean itself very droughty and dry in the summer months. So transversely, if you live, oh, here's a little, in a area where there's a river that's moved through since that last 10,000 year period and still today probably, and you're in this river floodplain valley, totally different, where you've had sedimentation kind of accumulating on top of whatever was left behind by the glacier 10,000 years ago. And these tend to be much, much more fertile soils that hold moisture better throughout the summer. And plant growth can be a lot more successful with minimal irrigation to no irrigation in the summertime. That's a little bit about soils. Oh, I wanted to say one thing about soils. If you're a real soil nerd and you want to research more, maybe Caroline, you could post this in the chat too. I think we will follow up with an email too with some of these links, but Web Soil Survey is if you just Google that usually takes you to a USDA website where you can, for free, kind of type in your address and kind of circle, and you'll pop up on a map, and you can circle a box or a ring around your area. I always tell people, go wider than just your little, quarter acre plot of King County, so you can see some of the soils at your property and around. And you can click on your different soil types, and it'll give you some technical, but also some layman terms of some of the soil properties. So that can be helpful for some people. Web Soil Survey. So then sunlight, we all know that factors in quite a bit. And probably most of us know this, it's not rocket science, but if you're south facing, because we live in the Northern Hemisphere, it's gonna be hotter and drier. And you're gonna wanna take that into account. And you can see some examples of that. This is more east side of the state, where the south side is the side that's so dry and so hot it can't support trees, but the north side, it can. We don't get to see these drastic plant community shifts here in Western Washington necessarily, at least for the layman's eye. But when you start learning your native plants, you will see shifts in plant communities in various different soil types and sunlight aspects. Okay, and then another thing, what about east and west? How does that play into it? And it's not going to be as drastic as north-south, but if you have a west side facing exposure, your plants are going to lean, or your site's going to lean a little drier than an east facing exposure. The reason being, east side, when the sun is shining on your plants from the east, that's usually earlier in the morning when the air temperature is cooler and it's less stressful for the plant. To the west, it's the opposite. The heat of our day is typically in the summertime, 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun is in that western part of the sky. So our plant's going to be more stressed out with that western exposure. And so you put them two together, if you have a southwestern aspect, that's the very, very most hot, driest aspect to have. Okay. Oh, I guess questions again already.
Okay, and then some more questions about the planting itself. Andrea asked, can you touch on planting with climate change in mind? Which I thought was a super interesting question.
Yeah, no, it's a big topic. Lots of people are talking about it. Yeah, I think it's a wise thing to do. I think the climate is changing and it's warming, right? So how drastically you want to take it to that level is of a lot of debate, but I think the science is out there that taking some level of shifting our genetic stock up a little bit from the south is a wise thing to do. I don't think most of us in the restoration ecology background are really going full sail to assist the migration of new species that are outside of our already geographic zone where they exist and planting them here as a native, restoration practitioner. But what we are doing is when we can and have the option of selecting different genetics of the plants, which we are fortunate that we can actually, these nurseries track and trace where they get their seed sources. So instead of, if I have the option of buying a Douglas fir from BC or Whatcom County up in the north versus a Douglas fir from, say, Olympia or Southern Washington, I'm going to go that route and take the Southern genetics for that species. How far you want to go, Douglas fir does exist all the way down to, Northern California, but that's maybe a bit of a stretch. So yeah, big topic on that. There's whole talks around that to search out for is, yeah, that's my little 1 to 2 minute bit on that, I guess.
All right. Should I throw another question at you, or do you want to?
Let's save them to the end. Let's make sure we get there to the end, and then keep asking questions at the very end again. Thanks.
All right, sounds good.
So now into some of my more favorite all-star plants. I'll break it up in moist, dry, and then really flexible all-around plants. So in about, I don't know, 8 plants per category. So if your soils kind of look like this for much of the winter and even into May and June, yeah, you're going to want some of these plants more so than the dry plants. And not too many people in their urban yard have room for a cedar tree, but if you do and you live more rurally, cedars love their feet wet. They also love their a little bit of shade to get established in. So if it is full sun, even if it's wet, you might want to nurse it along in the driest parts of the summer because we get pretty dry summers. But I love this tree. It's my favorite conifer, beautiful bark, rot resistant, really, the roots are real strong and rot resistant. So it's, one of the more safe ones to have near structures and homes. So Native Americans called it the tree of life because it provided so much of a valuable resource to them. But we won't highlight a lot of trees. Here's, if you don't have room for a big conifer tree, Oregon ash is a tree that is actually a very flexible, high survivorship tree where, it loves its feet wet, loves full sun, and quite drought tolerant in the summer. So if you have one of those scenarios where it's almost ponded, shallowly, real wet, saturated soils in the wintertime, but then once it dries out in the summer, it's really bone spanking dry. This is a great, and it's full sun, this is a great option for you. Another thing to note about Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia, is that deer and elk really don't tend to eat the leaves of this plant. So if you live in a more rural environment and you have deer issues, this is one that they really don't prefer to eat for some reason. I don't know why, never asked one. Okay, but transversely, if you have a more shady environment, this is a great plant that loves those mucky soils, edges of wetlands, but will prefer to stay shaded through that summer. So Cascara, Rhamnus persiana, and it has these little black berries. They're not really edible to people that I know of, but I think birds and wildlife they are, and they have a really beautiful fall color too. So Cascara is one that we usually sell through our plant sale, and not that many people know about it. So, but it's one of my favorites. Willow species, you know, these are the ones that you can stake, and they're real restoration champions. They're going to be your fastest growing. They're not necessarily always the prettiest. They do often have the, you know, the catkins that come out that are pretty, but they're not beautiful flowering plants. They're really a functional plant. If you've got a real, you know, wetland area and you want to establish some nice fast shade to shade out that grass or invasive grasses like reed canary grass, willows are great. Sitka willows, one species, but there's many other willow species. Pacific willow, Schooler's willow, those are some of the common ones. Hooker's willow. But they're not the willow that you might be thinking of the weeping willow that's a non-native ornamental willow. But these will grow pretty big. Sitka willow happens to be the smaller side of 15 feet tall, maybe, to 20. And Pacific willow being some of the taller willow, more like 35 feet tall. So more like almost like a small tree. One of my favorites is the Pacific 9-bark. Also, you remember we're still in the wet category. This one can tolerate full sun and wet and pretty flexible and durable. Easy survivorship, like all these, most of the species I'm highlighting. And one reason why I love it is it's got this, when you look closely at the bark, it's got this nice contrasting under light bark and outer dark bark. So even in the wintertime, it can provide that a pretty bark in an ornamental setting, even in the wintertime. And of course, it has a pretty little cluster of white flowers and seeds that birds love. Another wet-loving species that can be staked or purchased as plant, as potted or bare root materials, the twinberry. Very similar wet-loving species. I would hedge it a little bit more towards the shade and wet than the 9-bark, more sun and wet, but also a fast-growing, very flexible, good survivorship. And just like that Oregon ash, the deer usually do not prefer the twinberry. So one species that the deer love is red osier dogwood. So if you're going to plant some of these and you have deer, plant a lot of them, and maybe even consider putting some temporary fencing around them to keep them from munching them down. The other thing, beaver like red osier dogwood quite a bit too, and willow, the stakes of them. So if you have beaver issues along your aquatic area, these two, willow and dogwood, are highly preferred by beaver. But it has a beautiful little white flower, that white berry also you see. But also what people really love about the red osier dogwood is in the wintertime, the bark can, if it's in a more sunny environment, tends to turn this deep, bright red color. So, and that's another thing about this one, is it's fairly low for a shrub. It tops out at about that 10, 15 feet. But keep in mind that a lot of these plants, shrubs wise, get pretty big. They're not necessarily an ornamental little thing that's going to stay, you know, a little 5-foot radius for you. So planning for that ultimate height and growth is something to be considered. So salmonberry, we probably all know that one from if you've gone hiking in the woods and eating their berries, these beautiful salmon colored berries. So this too is it is thorny, but the thorns are not very sharp. They flake off really easily. So not something to really be too concerned about. But they like to spread and make like a thicket. So versus staying in one spot. And for ground covers in moist conditions, one of my favorites is deer fern, Blechnum spicant. And here's a picture of its kind of evergreen foliage. It kind of mostly dies back in the winter, but some of the leaves will stay green. And in the spring, you get these beautiful curling fronds that fiddleheads that come out. And then lastly, I think, is this wild ginger. which we do have at the plant sale as well this year, not every year. And it's got a really beautiful, delicate flower to it. So it's a native ginger of ours. And I think you could maybe do something out of the roots of the ginger, but I think they're so small that it's not really productive. Or if back to these droughty soils, if your soils are pretty dry, here's some species for you. Shore pine, starting big trees, evergreen. Here's one tree that I like to highlight, the Pinus contorta. This one will stay a little bit shorter for a conifer tree. So unlike the Douglas firs and the western red cedars that get 200 feet tall, this one's going to max out at more like 60, 70 feet tall, which is still big, but a lot shorter and smaller than some of our other ones. So maybe you might be able to fit one of these in your property. Super tough and durable, and actually quite flexible even in pretty wet soils. But it is very flexible on really droughty, dry soils. So that's a picture one about full grown. Interesting to note, shore pine, Pinus contorta, in common name, if grown on the kind of upper east side of the mountains, is called lodgepole pine, but they're the same species. That species there grows kind of, or the plant there grows more narrow, tall, straight, and down here in the low elevations, it grows a little shorter, open, airier, and yeah, shorter. So I think some of us put this early while we were waiting in the chat room as their favorite plant. This is red flowering currant, and you can see how showy it is every spring. It's a real, mouth dropper, and a great beneficial one for hummingbirds. So if you have one or more of these in your yard, I guarantee the hummingbirds are going to find it. And for about a month to 2 months, while this thing is in bloom, pretty early blooms, March, early March starts blooming, you're going to start seeing those hummingbirds visit. So yeah, this is oftentimes one very readily available in garden centers and nurseries, even just the non-native nurseries. Well, if they have a native section, they'll probably have red flowering currant, because it's often like the introductory plant for people planting their first native plant, because it is so beautiful and it's a really easy one to grow. Tall Oregon grape. So this is an example of a broadleaf evergreen. And if you're buying them bare root at our plant sale, one of the ones that you'll want to get in the ground right away, right after soaking the roots, to give them the best chance of survivorship. They can, when planted as a bare root, show signs of severe stress, and they'll drop all their leaves. Don't give up on the plant. It's a natural kind of like life support process where it's trying not to dehydrate itself too much. So it drops its leaves, and then it will sprout a whole bunch of new leaves later that spring. So continue to water it here and there, or tend to it. Don't give up on it if it drops its leaves in that first month or so. So, and the berries are edible, and there's a beautiful little yellow flower, but it has these holly-like pokey leaves, to something to be considerate of, to consider whether or not you like that or not. But it's a great kind of, remember we were talking about form and function, and if you need to replace a hedgerow next to your border of your neighbor's property, and you want something that's kind of fairly low and evergreen for privacy, this is a great species. Ocean spray, Holodiscus discolor, beautiful white flowers that bloom out in the kind of late spring. And these little Christmassy tree looking leaves. So I don't have a photo of it as a mature plant, but it's kind of a, takes kind of like a fountain shape, if you will. Many stems in the shrub, and one of the things I love about it is that the white flowers provide a thistle for little teeny birds like bush tits and chickadees. They'll love this ocean spray late into the fall. So these flowers stay on them as kind of brown seed sources, kind of all summer long and late into even into the fall, where it's a great food source for those little thistle feeding birds. Nooka rose. This is a great species for super sun, really hard to kill. Beautiful, rose, big pink flowers that bumblebees kind of love to land on, and almost like they're helicopters coming into landing on these landing pads. And then in the wintertime, they're going to have these red rose hips too. And its form-wise is going to spread on you, so something to be considerate of. They're thorny, and they're going to want to spread sideways through the rhizomes of the plant. So maybe not the best thing to plant right next to a walkway where it's continually encroaching upon your walkway. So something to think about. It's going to, but it does well if you plant a bunch of them together and they just kind of form a big thicket. They're also a good thing to plant kind of where you want to have native plants preserve a view corridor, because they stay relatively low, like 6 feet high is kind of when they start topping out, maybe 9 feet tall or so. But they can also be hedged and sheared and trimmed if you need to kind of keep the height down. I got to move quickly here, sorry. Mock orange is another, dry loving, can tolerate quite a bit of shade though too. Beautiful white flowers, lots of flowers. And this is one I'd really want you to, if you're going to a nursery to ask for a mock orange, you really want to ask for the Latin name, because there are a lot of species, ornamental species called mock orange. So Philadelphus lewisii is definitely one you want to remember the Latin name. And yeah, beautiful. Oh yeah, one of the things about the flowers is they tend to have kind of a citrusy, orangish smell, hence the name. Yeah, nice plant. And then ground cover, kinnikinick, you might be familiar with that. A great evergreen ground cover, provides these kind of late summer, fall red berries. And it's a spreading, creeping ground cover, stays very, very low to the ground. As does coastal strawberry. There's several species of native strawberries. This is the one that loves it very dry and sunny. And it will produce a little teeny strawberry that is very yummy, actually. If you put one of these in your mouth, it's going to taste like twice the strawberry flavor as a store-bought strawberry. It's amazing. So woodland strawberry, a couple of other species of strawberries prefer, if you find Frigeria virginiana and Frigeria, I'm blanking right now, Vesca, Frigeria Vesca, they like it shadier. So this is the sun-loving one. Okay, so we were talking about specialists, things that, like a peregrine falcon has a niche environment somewhat. And now here's a few plants that are really just generals, middle of the road, in between, pretty flexible plants, like acrylic. Vine maple, one of my favorites for the fall color, as you can see here. Can tolerate it in fair amount of sun, but not the best in like full spanking dry conditions. But it actually can flex very, very shady conditions, like full shade. But it's not going to really want like super wet feet, like a marsh plant, okay? Anyway, that's the Acer circinatum. There's a ton of maples out there in the world of nursery plants, but this is our native vine maple, which is like a big shrub. Our native tree maple, which is not highlighted here, would be the big leaf maple, which is a huge deciduous tree. Okay, moving on. Indian plum, Omlaria cerasiformis. This I love because it's the first thing to flower in the spring. we're talking mid-February, these white flowers are starting to come out. And yeah, it makes a little plum that is actually edible. It's more seed than fruit, but it's there. And not too bad to just kind of chew on right off the vine if they're ripe enough. Thimbleberry, again, now this is one of these rhizomatous spreading shrubs, middle of the road. Yummy, yummy berry. One of my favorite berries if you pick them when they're just right. And that's when they're this deep, deep red. Not the pink color, but the deep red color. Okay, nice flower. Soft fuzzy leaves, no thorns on that one. And then snowberry. Probably see this with these white berries, pretty indicative of they hang on late into the winter. You might even still see some snowberry on some shrubs now hanging on. A great flexible plant. And also, I like to highlight a very important kind of food source for the birds when there's not a lot of food for them, which is like late fall and early winter. Well, the birds don't prefer these berries to eat, but they're kind of forced to eat them when there's not that much else for them. Evergreen huckleberry is a real classic one that is another evergreen broadleaf, but a very slow growing shrub, but a yummy a yummy blueberry, a very late summer blueberry, and can stay pretty small. Pacific rhododendron is a very big, kind of a big shrub, but beautiful. This is our native rhododendron. There's lots of ornamental rhododendrons, of course, but rhododendron macrophyllum is our one native rhododendron, or at least the one that's most prevalent. There's other azaleas and stuff that are native too. And they tend to prefer more shade than sun. So, and low Oregon grape, I think this is the last one, maybe not, is a broadleaf. This is like the tall Oregon grape, but broadleaf evergreen, but stays very low, 1 to 2 feet tall, and also produces a little grape that you can eat. And yeah, definitely prefers shade over sun. And oh yeah, sword fern, of course, this is the last one. One of a classic, very tolerant plant, very transplantable to move around if you have opportunities to do that. And one of the things I like to tell people about the sword fern is that if the fronds start kind of looking, the older fronds, like 2-3 years later, start looking old and brown and crinkly, as they tend to do, you can actually, in the wintertime, cut the whole fronds off and back down to the ground. Do it midwinter before the new fiddleheads are starting to roll up. And then you get some nice new green fronds that are ferns that are sprouting out and can give it a nice refreshed look in your yard. All right, so hopefully that gave you a lot of good options to choose from. There's a lot more out there. That's just kind of my top picks. And hopefully it's inspired you to like other things that are local, right? We love our local sports teams. Some of us do. We like to shop locally, right? Some of my favorite cheeses, my favorite coffee, favorite beers are all, local stuff. So, I want to encourage you to think about your native local plants as well, and the benefits that they're going to have for you and the environment. So go forth and have fun with native plants. And, I can be a resource for you with follow-up questions as you might have here or even later through email. And yeah, let's take some questions about whatever people have.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Jacobus. Let me queue up another question for you. Let's see. We had a few questions specifically about red osier dogwood. So Julie was wondering if red osier dogwood is good for holding hills, and Jessica was wondering if it's good for combating English ivy and Himalayan blackberry because of the way that it spreads?
Yeah, it definitely can be if you have moist enough soils, is the one thing that I'll kind of like. If you, when you say hills, I don't typically think of hills being kind of the moist areas on people's yard. So, but we plant them on steep banks of rivers and stuff quite often. So, and they do spread through their roots rhizomously and have lots of fine roots that do a great job of adding slope stability. Your question is just going to be, is it moist enough on your hillside to support red osier dogwood? Willows do a great job of that too, with that bank stabilization aspects. And again, both of those can be planted as stakes, which is sometimes really nice to plant into slopes with stakes because you don't have to do as much soil disturbance. But again, those are moister species. If you have a slope that is more droughty and dry, and you want that kind of rhizomatous spreading, root holding characteristics, I highly recommend 3 species that I highlighted today would be the Nooka rose, very drought tolerant if it's a dry hill, rhizomatous spreading. Snowberry can be a great one too, also rhizomatous spreading, fine root hairs. And then also I'll throw out the thimbleberry also is another good option for slope stability and root, holding soils back. If it's not quite as wet for the red osier dogwood and the willow.
All right, great. We also have a couple of questions about planting zones and regions. And I know that we have some folks joining us from different parts of Washington, different parts of the country, and even different parts of the world. So I'm wondering, Jacobus, if you can give us some clarification on what planting zone King County mainly encompasses. And I know there's a few different zones, so maybe if you know those off the top of your head, that might be helpful.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Just for frame of
yeah,
reference.
that's kind of like a horticultural zone thing that I don't pay a lot of attention to, and maybe I should. But it is something that more concern when you're like bringing a non-native plant into this new environment. You want to match its zone. So as a restoration ecologist, we don't have to really pay that much attention to that because they already natively exist here. So I know I've seen that. I want to say like 7 or something. Maybe someone else in the chat box can add that info that's more it's got it off the top of their head, and it's probably pretty easily to Google that. I would think. Mm-hmm. So and. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing in the chat someone saying from 6A to 9A, but yeah, I think that is a really good point that if you're trying to plant native plants, they've adapted over thousands and millions of years to be specifically in the region. So I could see how that would apply more for ornamentals and for horticulture. All right. Let's see, we might have time for just one more question. So let's pick another. Dan and Candace were asking about a region of their yard where they have a Doug fir that's over 60 feet tall and it's pretty dry and shady underneath. So what would you recommend planting underneath a tree like that?
Yeah, well, the Holodiscus discolor, the ocean spray, tends to do quite well in very dry conditions and shady conditions. So you might, with the super dry conditions, you'll want to lean towards, if you can, getting it established with some water through the first 2 summers, perhaps, periodically. And that's one whole nother thing we didn't really talk about with watering, but I'll just say most of these plants will prefer some watering for the first year, especially. They don't need a ton, but just a little bit to keep them along, and hedge the watering towards the front end of the summer, and then tapering it off to none or little later in the summer. And infrequent deep waterings is much better than frequent light waterings. So anyway, so yeah, the ocean spray shrub, beaked hazelnut is another one. If you can, it's a little taller though, that can do quite well. Sword fern can actually do quite well in dry, shady conditions. Again, you might need to kind of nurse it along with a little bit of water. But, and then even the evergreen huckleberry can be a good dry, sun, shade plant for you there. Again, because it's really dry, you're going to want to probably focus on a little bit of watering in that first summer. Yeah.
All right, awesome, thanks. Super good advice. But I want to really thank you, Jacobus, for sharing your time and knowledge with us this evening. And I want to thank everyone who joined us. I'm super inspired by your interest in this topic, and I firmly believe in the ripple effect that engaging in native planting and habitat restoration creates, and that healing of the ecosystem definitely comes back to us as well, in terms of the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. So I appreciate everyone who's pushing forth with this effort. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. I hope you keep getting excited about the awesome power of native plants, and I hope that everyone has a lovely evening and that we can see you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you all.
All right, thank you everybody. Bye.